Over a year ago, I made a video like I normally do about villains, talking about the infamous Maleficent, the supreme leader of all Disney villains that is undeniable today, remaining as a classic evil antagonist that represented all the bad that we fight for, against good versus evil, dark versus light. Because what more can you say when the character herself alludes to all the powers of hell, or even says the forces of evil to her own minions? It is literally a villain designed for the purpose of being a villain, contrasted with the good fairies of the world for all simple petty reasons because she wasn't invited to the birth of the princess. But speaking about all of this, especially in recent times, that we kind of may or may not be getting out of, comes a time when villains start to become less villainous, bringing us this new era of live action films that started to make some of them more sympathetic or actually anti-heroes in some form, to go even as far as to make them the main protagonists of their own new very retellings, such as Cruella that I discussed earlier, or even the main obvious topic today in Maleficent, the reimagining of Walt Disney's Sleeping Beauty. Released back in 2014, this was a film I sort of discussed in the past of something generally I liked for a fresher take, especially when I was young watching it, finally making an iconic character that so many know about join in the forefront, but now realizing it accelerated a dire trend of making villains not villains anymore. In its basic essence, this story focusing on the evil fairy is more about rewriting it to make her more of an anti-hero of that very film, or more specifically what I like to call an anti-villain story in the title of this video, because for a while now I have toyed with characters in Disney who are anti-villains, mostly good characters who still oppose the heroes in their own right in their own terms of that very goal, that they still remain to be villains but end up not really being villains at all. Where in terms of a movie like this, we are actually referring to something a different fact, since she is more of an anti-hero or a straight up hero by some definitions of the movie, that goes along with this fact that it is against the true definition of what Maleficent is, or what we expect her to be, negating her villainous nature and appearing the same without the evil attributes that remain to be more sympathetic. In this story, she is a fairy that just was good-hearted, just like other anti-villains, but how society where the king reside was just so against her for who she was specifically. And in the past, I've also shown the sequel in some of my other videos, and certainly can bring up some facts from that film, where for the sake of this video, releasing it on its villainous topic, it will predominantly focus on what this film brought specifically that spiraled into the world that we reside today, with films coming out like Mufasa. Not of course alluding to the fact that Mufasa was a villain at all to mention all of this, it still is more of an origin story, but then again characters like Scar, who is the villain on the other hand, is involved with his own backstory, being a part of the royal family rather than Mufasa for the reasons they desperately need to connect people with. The point being made here is that it is the staple ground zero for these types of films or characters showing up, rewriting them to become something they are not. And while this will still focus on the unique good parts of what they did, which is more than you can say for the rest of these live action films, it still does something worse in service of the foes that they're trying to present to us, to understand more about them, but actually less than it should. And to the point where I said this is less worse than all the other live action films, there are still many positives to it alongside its negatives. One where you can feel validated if you decide to like this interpretation of Maleficent on its own, but also hate it because they destroy everything about the evil fairy that you know. Also, it's pretty hard to believe that this movie is already 10 years old, which makes things a little bit more awkward when you look upon the last 10 years when these types of films have been oversaturated to this point. A point where you must describe who Maleficent is before delving into the movie's comparison. Because as we know in the original Sleeping Beauty film, Maleficent is this evil fairy that appears at Aurora's birth, angry at simply not being invited and nothing more. Where in turn, because of these facts, she curses Aurora to prick her finger when she turned 16 on a spinning wheel so that she would die, and then how that was changed to be a coma by the real good fairies until true love's kiss comes to save the day, as all good fairy tales are known for. Her whole character is based upon pure pettiness, that she revels in her own nature, again in later scenes lambasting her minions for being a mockery to the forces of evil, living in a decrepit castle filled with nothing but villainous green, works to force Aurora to fulfill her curse, turns into a dragon to kill Philip, where she is finally defeated herself, killed by a magical sword. All actions to really stop the progress of the hero because they know themselves that they are evil and they accept it. The way they live, the way they talk is how we are informed what a character's role should be, which looking back on it now, it should hurt to know that this film was originally planned as an animated film too. During Don Hahn's meeting with Disney Animation, he pitched a project revolving around the evil fairy's origin story, which in a way this film is, but it also is a retelling retelling of Sleeping Beauty overall, so the idea itself would still be different and interesting to develop the character to the point of view that we know them as, not as what she could have been herself as if she was the hero. But sadly, of course, when Disney bought Pixar during the time, it gave way for them to make it more into a live action film with someone like Angelina Jolie interested in the picture, making more sense for a movie like this when they less focused their efforts on 2D sadly, where the main idea would be to look at events that made Maleficent curse a child, but also make you look differently about the character itself, even if the character again said she's clearly a part of the forces of evil. The other interesting factor was that they wanted Tim Burton involved with this, which made sense since the same people involved in these projects during the time were also making the Alice in Wonderland live action film that spurred this entire era off, and how he got more busier working on that film instead, where they were both written by Linda Wolverton, who Don Hahn approached after working with him on films like Beauty and the Beast and Lion King, the most successful films of the Disney Renaissance era, now making something that develops her up until the beginning of the original film for the point of what we know her as, but also saying it's not just a retelling, but a reinvention of the very same story, which is very crucial to highlight in the sense that we relate ourselves to the title of this being an anti-villain movie, because it reinvents a design of one particular character to be more protagonistic, heroic in their own right from beginning to end, since as you will see, because since she is the main character of this film, she doesn't die. That is instead transferred to another character who is the main villain of that film.
I realized there was an enormous challenge of how to make someone who could be that cruel and that evil into someone that we could care about. What on earth happened to her that she would be so angry that she would curse an innocent child? And in the original fairy tale, Maleficent was a fairy. When I found out that she was a fairy, the whole thing opened up for me. Where were her wings? The other fairies have wings. And then the light bulb went off for me of, well, that's what happened to her. Someone stole her wings.
I told my girls, I want to tell you the real story of Maleficent. And then my little boy the next day got in a fight with one of my daughters because he was saying Maleficent's evil. And my daughter was saying, you don't understand. You don't know everything. And I thought, you know, don't we all wish we could say, but you don't know me completely. You don't see the full picture. You think she's evil, but maybe something happened to her.
And what you just heard right here that I wanted to highlight is something that relates on, again, to every other sympathetic live-action Disney villain that relates further on. That they want you to see and look inside something even though they played clips and heard actual actors say that she is the symbol of pure evil. She looks like something you would detest because that is her role and she revels in it. But there is that other side that other characters mentioned, like, what if you don't know that side of the person of the way that they are, even though they said clearly in the first film that this is the way that they are, that the entire gist of this is seeking a perspective that really doesn't exist in the first place.
Maeve, the mistress of all evil.
Of course, there is something, the good validation of, you know, she grew up as a fairy, what happened to her as a youth. That is something that makes perfect sense to do, but it also contradicts these certain actions when you say she should be a little more sympathetic, even though she might say that she is a part of the forces of evil or all the powers of hell, as I will keep drilling. But above all, what can be either good or bad in making such a film this way, Angelina Jolie still remained to be the perfect choice for the character, a fact everyone could praise even if you felt mixed like the critics did on the very film itself. Because indeed, she truly does look the part very well and acted very well that you might normally think of the character in her best moments, even the vulnerable parts of the sympathetic hero side. Would you have to applaud them for thinking this way, that she could be the only one choice to play the character, because there really wasn't any other at the time that you could have seen done that made an effective argument for such a movie to exist on an iconic character. But getting back on track, we should start back at the beginning of the film. The main separation that makes Maleficent more of its own story before it goes right back into Sleeping Beauty. Because as you know, for the most part of Disney's live action films, they do spend more time in the backstory of a character, and that has to be done for this version going all the way back to her own youth as a fairy. Cause another point to add is how people just categorize her as a straight up witch. This obviously is the most interesting section since it dives into the world that she inhabited, being the Moors, a magical forest that was next to the human world that we all know in the original Sleeping Beauty taking place. Or quite kind of, where they say that the Moors is this beautiful place where all creatures had no ruler and trust in each other, compared to the human kingdom where people held their government and their king in contempt. Something that clearly was the opposite of everything Sleeping Beauty eventually showed in their own kingdoms of jolly citizens and kings, although this was before such kings even took such power. This is the first sign of the shifting perspective of the very film, the certain direction of this reinvention rather than retelling, since it shows us a world of fairies that all respected each other with relentless beauty, and the fact that Flora and Fauna and Merryweather were kinda sort of friends or neighbors, with Maleficent being relatively close to knowing each other. Of course, they all knew each other in the original film too, to a larger extent, but now we get to see how this was since they knew her when she was young, and the fact that she helped all the other creatures out, compared to this one who helps herself or her pet Diablo. And actually, I forgot to say this too, their names are not Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather. No, just like future live-action Disney films that change the names of other characters like the hyenas in The Lion King, they're instead named Knotgrass, Flittle, and Thistlewit, as if those names make the story any better. The big reason we have to mention this is because how they do this constantly afterwards with the aforementioned hyenas or other minor characters in other Disney films. A fact that I completely blanked on from noticing originally until I looked at the damn cast of the film, and then of course watched them later on when they said it themselves, where it feels like they only changed this for the cultural makeup of the story setting to somehow again make it its own separate distinction rather than being completely the same, which just makes no sense at all because these people mostly associate these characters with such names, as it is easier even within the concept of the backstory type of film. Even if you go to a Disney park or any other story, you would still hear Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather, because if you don't do that to the main characters who we already know and expect them to be similar to their animated counterparts, then why do any of this at all? Just another personal gripe and issue I have with these films for saying it is one thing, but then barely making an effort to differentiate itself as another. The apple of being the same story and setting, and the orange of being different character names that don't align itself just very well. Same, but different, if that makes sense to you. And better yet, that's not the only name change you'll get to see in any of these films at all. But I mean, that doesn't mean I should knock down the film completely for being different in the first 30 minutes before the official scene, similar to Sleeping Beauty's point of the story, because at the very least in this part, and the reason why I thought it was in the better half of their own live action films, it just does do more to be completely separate from Sleeping Beauty in its own world of Maleficent's background, telling us what we should know about its characters when we know how they both end up, which obviously refers to the fact that King Stefan, Aurora's father, had a past with Maleficent. Their reactions in the beginning to each other become a little more justified in this story's version that also takes its own shape. One where they make it a fact that he was a peasant boy in his youth, not royally related to the king as you would have probably assumed originally, not that you know for a fact that he was, but how you assumed in a fairy tale things alright, and how you could see a different side of things to know how they got to their positions of power. But again, for this story, it certainly is very interesting for both of them to interact with each other, to have a beginning to foster around their relationship that feeds into the personal connection to cursing Aurora finally. Cause again, she does just show up like that, just being petty and not being invited, cursing her to die when she turns 16 with some specifics to it. But I guess the point to counteract that, for me and many others however, is that it can be frankly good enough to just justify a villain doing this, because she is a villain like she describes, but how this story actually does somewhat of a good job explaining a hurtful backstory to some degree, a past that validates two characters in the present. But how we finally end things is another matter and issue to be discussed. The typical story of how they both fell in love with each other, as to be expected in this kind of area, and how it was all framed when they first met. A forbidden love between two kingdoms that could be friendly, man and fairy connected at last. Yet like all fatal stories, he does grow apart for her in service of the king in the background who wants nothing more but to conquer the Moors. The point to start highlighting her wings as a main attribute to our character and species as a whole that make them defenders and protectors of the Moors from such threats. Where we of course are highlighting the fact that Maleficent does have wings in this film. You get the point of why they actually include it, because they're this certain species. Even though you can also make the other point that Maleficent does kind of transports herself to a certain location and flies with her own magic without it. She doesn't actually need it, but then of course showing a backstory of what they were like as a species. And in the meantime, showing how Stefan is a servant of the king whom, after getting wounded by Maleficent, is close to his death, now declaring the man who would kill her would become king, marrying his daughter, who we know becomes later the queen or the mother of Aurora. And this part now explains who he is, a backstabber who fell in love with the villain and used his position of friendship and romance to work his way up to rule the kingdom. By this we mean the fact that he tells her the truth of what King Henry wants to do to her and tries to reconnect with them, stopping any harm to come to her way, making up for the years of loneliness and ruthless ambition. But however, this was of course all a trick, where his heart could never directly kill her, but how he still strikes at her heart regardless by betraying and cutting her wings off after he drugged her. That we now see a character whose ambition still overshadowed his love, yet still had a bit of regret hinted in his own actions, not able to kill the supposed enemy because he probably did still indeed love her, rewarded for being a traitor in this regard, and finally informing us who Maleficent would eventually become, a villain created out of hurt, betrayal, and a former love now festered into hate, where such evil is festered out of the darkness of man's own heart, leading her to the future with the background of her pet companion, Diablo, whom, like I said earlier, what you would eventually find out, his name is also changed to something else called Diavol, as he says when he saves his life when he was under a net, turning him into a human.
What do I call you?
Diavol.
Why do this name change, you might ask? Well, I think this one's a more simpler than the others solely on the basis of the fact that this is an anti-villain movie, that she is not the evil witch you expected her to be. She is a tragic fairy character now picking up the pieces of her broken life being ruined, where we can't have any names like Diablo connecting to that because that obviously alludes to the devil, right? Diablo is obviously associated with things of a devilish nature, and she is not. She saves people and is a part of this fairy species. And if you're going to ask where her minions will end up being, just don't. They really don't even exist in this form at all, like those types and not the Moors that she protects that you see right here. But back to the main point at hand, they make Diablo a shapeshifter in this version so he can communicate with Maleficent about his findings as a raven and then become human so he can speak English for story purposes. Most of his development in this film is literally for that fact alone, and not really much more that I say since he comes back with reports that make her angry to solidify her bitter current character, finally relaying the news that Stefan has a newborn baby. Hence, the events of Sleeping Beauty begins. This is the moment where two movies merge into one, you might say. Another scene that is mostly same but slightly different. Of course, with the fairies introducing themselves personally instead of how they get royally introduced, and now finally stating their new names that I shall not use ever again because that is just stupid, before the final reintroduction of the villainess herself named Maleficent, appearing as she just once did to all audiences before, with less green of course. And this scene is where the script itself is almost, and I mean almost, captures the entire scene word for word in their original introduction, with a few minor tweaks here and there, making it a bit shorter and more for the characters. Her not being invited, the smug attitude, and the final curse where it's all there. Where I would like to point out that it does prove that Angelina Jolie was the perfect choice for playing Maleficent, appearing finally as we know her as, and also having the complete attitude for it. Just wishing they could have went completely with this overall evil relation character rather than what came from before and eventually after this. She just does a terrific job at doing so. But alas, she cannot be that way. It still has to be anti-heroic or morally good in some form, which is the main different part between versions, since she actually makes the conditions when her curse is present, meaning no power on earth can change what she said, but also putting in the condition saying asleep like death until wakened by true love's kiss, because Stefan begged and pleaded not to go through with this since this version has the characters that are more connected with, and he still feels a little regret in his own development, which is compared to the original version where she just says she pricks her finger, she did, and that's it.
She will prick her finger on the spindle of the spinning wheel and fall into a sleep like death.
She shall prick her finger on the spindle of a spinning wheel and die.
Where it was actually Merryweather that redid the condition from death to become a coma until true love's kiss would come, as her gift wasn't given, being rudely interrupted by Maleficent.
The princess can be woken from her death sleep, but only by true love's kiss.
and this is another proof to the point of how they were really not in the business of making her a villain due to prior connections that didn't exist and the efforts into making this movie a reinvention, with Stefan taking a more prominent role since everything he built was on her personal suffering, and now he's the one freaking out about how to do things, destroying the spinning wheels like before, but not like the original version, being more dignified in his own approach from his own character. Also, Sleeping Beauty moreover goes into this straight time skipping 16 years later, making it clear that Flora, Fauna, and Merryweather are the biggest characters of the film by their own screen time, since they wanted to focus on that relationship to protect her rather than what else Maleficent is thinking in the between time, just like this does. Where also you might notice here that Maleficent, since her duty is to the moors, does not really have her castle high above in a threatening, pointy, unstable mountain, only making a thorn-covered wall protect the moors to stop any human that Stefan might send, because it has to differentiate itself when she eventually sees Aurora for the second time, or instead of not knowing quite well where she was 16 years later, berating her own minions for not being able to find her since the fairies did a bang-up job, unlike these nitwits, she is immediately able to find out where she is, because she's a good girl in this film now, and we have to accept this. And now I'm starting to see the point of why we shouldn't like this film after debating my own 13-year-old self who actually liked it. And so to continue down this unvillainous path to be more creative with the film's liberties, they take this other interesting direction that she knew from the very beginning of where they would actually take her, since all of them actually did live in the moors, which is enough so that she could get the better of their own horrible judgment. I mean, compared to their animated counterparts, they are absolutely horrible at raising her, because she's just right at the side toying with them, all compared to the 16 years they kept her a secret from everyone, including Maleficent, because this version has a pure heart that wants to look after the daughter of her own former lover, the real truth revealed behind it all. This is where I want to first mention my closing statement in the entire video, that you look at scenes like this as an example that is both bad and also good, since I don't believe it's neither way that cancels everything out, as this is a film you can love for its interesting side of Maleficent's hidden life, like I said in the intro, but also detested for making her appear to be morally good, originally pure-hearted character that does care about the one she cursed due to their loving past, that you can find it fitting either side of the argument well, hence why it's balanced higher on the scale, yet how you can truly feel like they don't understand such point of designs the way animators like Mark Davis gave to her originally, or the story writers themselves. But the more interesting point, other than Maleficent actually interacting with Aurora in this version, is the continued focus on Stefan as king, succumbing to paranoia, because you wouldn't see him in the original film until like 40 minutes later having a bit fun with his friend King Hubert, Philip's father, who doesn't appear in this film at all until the sequel itself, and is also unfortunately renamed too, as we'll get to later. Anyways, the point being here is that he was only hanging out to discuss what would happen to the potential marriage with his own friend, but how they did a better job in this film expanding his character since his first appearance in the film when he fell in love with Maleficent, to the point of where he wants to fall into pure insanity to kill her after everything he built on betraying her. That this is the strong suit of what this live action film could do that ends up in a positive rather than the future films doing a negative. Like, I really do think that this is a bit better in the course of the actions of the film, of what he would do to stop her rather than how he appears angry at her and just doesn't dwell much upon it after 16 years thinking the fairies did a good job. The same fairies who would later put everyone to sleep so they wouldn't be heartbroken to find out that she did prick her finger until the very end when she came back. Sometimes it's probably those differences in the story quality that makes you do like it a bit more, and something we should commend for the movie doing in that regard, especially even going as far as looking at the relationship between Aurora and Maleficent when she grows up, like being a protector who tries to push her away for her own cold attitude and broken heart, but eventually warm up as a fairy godmother type figure according to the young girl. I mean, obviously I would say something like this because Aurora in Sleeping Beauty has the smallest amount of screen time of any Disney hero or Disney princess, again, being 18 minutes total, and only 18 lines of dialogue where she doesn't even speak in the second half of that film. Or better yet, the fact that she doesn't really even interact with her own villain Maleficent, which is kinda disappointing. Of course she does appear after she commits to the curse, but she felt like asleep dead at that point. So in another win for this very film, if you want to say that, this one directly has them both finally interacting in more ways than one, and finally boosts involvement from Aurora with more lines, making her a true character. Just how it comes at the cost of, well, making other characters complete jokes or anti-villains. Also, thinking about those Aurora facts just makes me sad a bit for Mary Costa not having much to say, because she did a great job and Walt Disney did say to her she did have a beautiful voice that can naturally come off in both singing and talking. Not that I'm taking any away from that, since they all came to praise it either way, but in the course of how we know the characters to be included, even if they are the main title ones. You know, they should have more involvement from that, and it barely exists. It kinda sticks out that she isn't involved like Philip or Merryweather, Flora or Fauna, who, like I said before, had the most screen time, where they become more of the de facto main characters, compared to their new versions that are bumbling idiot side pieces who do a piss poor job in raising the girl, unlike Maleficent. Weird twist, I might say, cause we see she truly does care every time she watches from afar, wanting to get close to the Moors, protecting by dispatching Stefan's guards, where we also finally get to see that Diablo doesn't just transform from a human to raven, he can also shapeshift into whatever Maleficent wants as she pleases.
How could you do that to me?
You said anything I need.
Yeah, but not a dog.
It was a wolf, not a dog.
It's the same thing.
Make me question why she didn't even think about doing that herself, when in the original, she is the one who actually did all the transforming, or not to any of her guards. Like, literally, she is the most powerful Disney villain to date, right? Why shouldn't she do this herself and do everything with ease? Oh yeah, that's right, this is an anti-villain film. She's a morally good character. She can't transform into anything powerful because she's not that type of character anymore. Just a personal side note of the way things are performed in the film, when she finally lets Aurora into the kingdom of the Moors to meet face to face.
I know who you are.
Do you?
You're my fairy godmother.
What?
Now saying that she thinks she is her fairy godmother since she was taking watch for 16 years slowly, where it kinda changes things in Maleficent, starting to care about Aurora more since we know to her character and what she originally loved actually cares even if she was working towards to break Stefan all the time for what he did. The story now making characters trend into the opposite directions, seeing that he's now obsessed with getting her and nothing more, not caring about the fact that his wife is on her deathbed, hardening himself when she starts to open up. You see her in this part having fun when she starts to smile a bit, leading to the point of where she actually wants to revoke the curse that she put on but can't due to story circumstances of differing attitude.
I revoke my curse!
Only saying something like this because you know, it is a fact that these events in the film still need to play out like it did in the original, but how they make it just as irreversible in this part to focus on her own regrets. Even though again, she strangely put the condition in this version of True Love's Kiss to break it compared to Merryweather. So she kinda already made this curse breakable in its own way, so the spell wouldn't work regardless, other than to hone in the point of her good-hearted nature underneath this thick skin. Oh yeah, and the fact that she said no power on earth couldn't even do it suggests to Selland the weird conditions that the normal plot armor usually puts in these films.
This curse will last to the end of time! No power on earth can change it!
This entire portion changes things completely of what we know about Maleficent. It is an entirely new character from here on out that negates all of her villainous attitudes or attributes discussed. Yes, we saw the opening prologue and the events that transpired that were clearly different, but then again you would have had to assume that the origin point of the curse would have opened up to this more darker character that we have seen, instead of one who dresses more in light tones in the home that she resides. The dramatic shift in the movie's ideals creates a new entirely different version as this video suggests, where we can no longer compare the Maleficent that we knew because this one clearly cares about the people, compared to Stefan. This is where you also have to bring up the reason that she was named that there came a purpose with combining the words like magnificent and malicious to become Maleficent in some way that describes who exactly this character is, representing all the traits to that very name. And how now, when we look back upon her introduction here and the overall protective nature that she provides since she wants Aurora to simply stay to the Moors, this doesn't make any logical sense to be her entire name. Like, the fact remains at the very beginning of the film, they called her Maleficent, even though she was a loving fairy at that very beginning and people still respected her that very way. Like, why couldn't it have been something different? Like, even in Cinderella, her name was Ella in the beginning and she was called Cinderella because of the cinders on her face. You know, that kind of entire backstory of stories that Disney even likes to do to some names like Solo instead of keeping this name that clearly described someone with malicious intent or was nicknamed that certain way because they knew what they were doing. In a nutshell, in this entire movie, she's just simply magnificent according to this movie's traits, where the dubious nature is actually given to the irrational paranoid tyrant King Stefan instead for this very story. Also in the moment where we get to see Philip for the first time in all of the film compared to how he was with the horse in the forest. But the difference is now compared to that version is how Philip was present at Aurora's christening when he was a little boy. Not that this says much about anything that is happening now, but a clear downgraded focus on his own character, portrayed by the guy who actually became Henry Turner, Will Turner's son in the worst Pirates films later on. The major difference here is that it's kind of tame in their initial meeting. It's not like the original where Aurora, then hidden as Briar Rose, was singing Once Upon a Dream in the forest and he joined in his beautiful voice, where it's just them talking. Literally, there's no musical in this entire film like many other future live-action films and remakes would do, being more borderline the same rather than different based upon the confines of the story. Which, to be fair, is good that the story takes that direction, because at least it knows its own strengths and weaknesses of what can be done. But you know, it's at the cost of Prince Philip's existence, as you will eventually see, agreeing up completely with whomever wrote the Wikipedia description of both are mildly attracted to each other, cause this ain't even an inch similar to what those two felt in these scenes. Another example of how bad this is how Philip returned to the castle to meet with his father, exclaiming that he doesn't want this arranged marriage to be a princess, but to this peasant girl he found in the woods that would coincidentally still be the actual princess, making him stand out at the time for a Disney prince having his own character if we look at all the criticisms during the time of how they were plot devices for princesses rather than actual characters or human beings with their own conscience. Not to say Charming or the other prince didn't, they had their own wants, but seeing as we mostly don't see them beyond their own areas compared to Sleeping Beauty that made an effort to make him a huge player who does battle with Maleficent, he was a big upgrade for Disney princes at the very time, where this one hardly exists outside of those boundaries like his original counterpart. Another big downgrade that props up the fairy even more. I mean, I get that the story is not focusing on them like they did before, but the actions you will see them take completely ruin such ideas. But Maleficent would still use this in the event that she couldn't stop herself from sealing her own eventual fate, as the stupidly named incompetent fairies reveal the truth that her father is alive after lying about her parents were dead from the beginning, virtually making her upset and sad at Maleficent for cursing her and all that they know, finally returning back to the castle to meet up with Stefan for the very first time. Another difference where the fairies did take her back with the truth in the tower in the castle, but before they could even officially meet her real parents who still anticipated this. In this version, she goes back on her own to really meet him for the first time, with some excitement, but how his blind hatred made him go so far to not care as much.
They brought you back a day too soon. I told those 3 idiots, lock her up in her room. Go.
Yes, he does say some things like she looks like her mother, but just like he abandoned seeing her after her death, he completely brushes her off, being too early from the nitwits who took her here before her birthday to not prick her finger. He cares more about his battle with Maleficent, diving more into his deranged insanity, than to reconnect with his own child and family, which again is still much better than the original Stefan in my opinion, which is a good thing going for the movie. Having him with more beliefs and more things to do adds a better strength of this entire film. And I don't think it's that he doesn't care about his own daughter, but how he corrupted himself with his own guilt so many years ago to Maleficent in this version, trying to finally end things once and for all to get rid of the shame, battling instead of, falling asleep later on, and how now she on the other hand drags Philip back to the castle in case she succumbs to the curse up until this point in the film, rather than how she herself ensured her demise and he had to do it after defeating the powerful villain. This is the other huge tonal shift to the story. Not exact similarities in the detail, but finally reinventing the idea with what each version had. The one where Maleficent fulfills her plan and locks Philip up until she grows old, and the other one now bringing him here to try to fulfill her own mistake. The strongest point that you might have that butchers everything that the original stood for, with the character that revels in her own victory as a villain, forcing him to stay here until he's old and grey, while she would never have aged a day, never having such true love. Of course, these are points that are counteracted in the film by Stefan himself after Aurora pricked her finger, which made this version of Maleficent heartbroken and stopping rather than gloating in victory.
What about the kiss? Yes, true love's kiss.
True love does not exist.
giving up on that as he'd finally nailed himself to bitterness and destruction for the rest of his days to come. Where, what a surprise, in the biggest twist validating what he just said, Philip's kiss does not work. The big twist of the entire film that you obviously couldn't have saw coming, with the main man who did break the curse now not doing so, and he's shoved out of the entire film just like that until probably the end. And if you really didn't think this was anything other than a retelling, then you probably would think otherwise when they rewrote the entire story for Maleficent to come in apologizing to her own faults that actually now awakens her with her true love's kiss. Again, like everything we just said, this is the moment that either makes the film if you appreciate different takes of who they are, or breaks it if you remember what was embedded into the hallowed halls of the esteemed Disney villains brand. It's a truth that is very hard to digest, but in terms of the makeup of the story, it's apologizing for the faults that prove how much more the characters could be, or in turn makes every subsequent remake break their own to become sympathetic beings that deserve our own respect. But you'd be surprised to see me admit that I particularly do not hate this at all still. Sure, I find it a bit more bad considering what I know now comparing all of these things, but in favor of the specific arc that they were going for, it's alright. We know that from beginning to end of what we are knowing about Maleficent, that's the direction they want, which is fine and accepting compared to a random ass twist in films like Frozen that happened near the end that wasn't anticipated. That in the sense of this film, we can understand the real meaning of love beyond the sense of another partner or companion, yet caring for family. Motherly love in that regard, since we spent time with Aurora and Maleficent throughout. It fits. Still fitting the time Disney was in when you realize Frozen was just released a year before, with the sisters and their own love thawing the end go. But then again, on the other hand, they really didn't build up Philip at all as a character in this sense that you would know in this plan that would have worked due to his minor involvement. They made the science way too easy for that, and this was going to happen, which is a bad thing and still doesn't justify itself well in its past in terms of how these separate puzzle pieces are fit in. Yet how I remain to be okay with this fact, in their own relationship there was allowed to flourish that made it acceptable at the very least. Not that it's a great thing, but it's an okay thing in my current opinion. But then things start to get worse when they finally capture her in this part of the movie. She's chained down, Stefan's got his moment to finally get rid of her. Well, not yet, that's a bit later when he actually appears. But how it's when she's under the net, she turns Diablo into a dragon. Where I can tell you now, after everything I've forgiven up until this point, this is indeed the most insulting thing that this movie has ever done, now coming up with the true excuse of him getting all the transformations in the movie rather than Maleficent. She's just that too good of a character or a fairy to even dare transform into something that could help our own situation. Again, validating that same response that she could even have the powers, but she doesn't want to, even if the net is magic negating or whatever. Gone is the fact that she could transform into whatever she likes, like a dragon that was summoned with all the powers of hell, and it now becomes something I could turn this damn bird to replace that. Above all things, weirdly enough, this was just completely ruins everything about this in my opinion, because you don't allow her to be anything but. Even as a fairy in the original, she could use her own powers to fly or transform without even her wings, but how this decides that that's not a thing that she should do for the sake of whatever this direction wants, like getting her wings instead. And then my own continued maturity, I don't know how you can defend such things when you don't allow it to happen because you don't want her to have anything else other than the wings back. That she could affect this creature, then surely she could do it to herself. Seeing time and time again of how powerful she really is, like over everyone else in this damn film. Like she has all the powers even more so than the smaller fairies, and she could do whatever she wants. Cause the wings is actually the true event that they are leading up to clearly when Stefan comes to gloat to his final victory, saying nasty things to someone he connected to originally.
How does it feel to be a fairy creature without wings? In a world where you don't belong!
Which I now question despite having a stronger character presence after everything he did, just being a selfish bastard this entire time. Where, after getting her wings, she's now portrayed in her grand moment in this entire film that can contrast with the original in terms of portraying a demon now as an angel if you put these two dragons side by side. This is the difference of perception of how these films separate themselves into two unique paths, with the one who wants to kill and the one who wants to save. Because the evil is now simply Stefan, who simply wants destruction as she originally laid waste to, but how she does not want to kill him at all, saving him to be better than the rest. yet how he chooses not to, finally grabbing her on, but then slipping to his own ultimate death, falling down like the original Maleficent fell after she was stabbed into nothing. The tragic end that finally settled things for the better as the Moors was freed once again when Aurora was their new queen, settling peace throughout the kingdoms that allowed Maleficent to let her hair down once again since the beginning of the movie, with Philip appearing once again to drive in the fact that he still exists as a character for the eventual love interest of Aurora for some reason. Maybe just to connect back with the remake, I guess, or the fact that they would do a sequel. But above all, the ending narration finally confirms of what kind of film this really was after everything is done and dusted with who Maleficent is.
My kingdom was united not by a hero or a villain, as legend had predicted, but by one who was both hero and villain.
Wait, what? You know what? This just doesn't make any sense. I just find it stupid to say that she was both hero and villain this entire time when she acted more like an anti-hero or an anti-villain, which I know is literally just the opposite of what she just said in this narration that can be the same in some form, but how it's more in favor of heroics overall, what I mean by that certain regard. That she does some bad things, of course, but then Stefan overall did the worst over time. Her actions are mostly justified as a protagonist who really doesn't want to show much ill will to others and is more portrayed as darker due to the nature of the situation. Again, stating that most of what she does is really not villainous, contrary to the narrator's statement. Only thinking this applies to the inherent nature of this film compared to the original Sleeping Beauty, saying both villain and hero in that sense, but broadly in one area like this particular film actually does not. The end statement likes to take this road of appeasement, making you think you can have both versions of the character in one film, but it doesn't work that way. This is not a villain. This is simply a hero of its own film. This doesn't mean it relates to what I described to, as you can both find good and bad of what it represents that can be taken away from the film, but the definition of the particular film I've advocated from the start of this video being an anti-villain, because it works in the interest of removing the complete definition of what Maleficent is or was, being obviously a Disney villain. Sure, a villain can become a hero, or a hero can live long enough to become the villain, but it's not both at the same time. Because I'ma just ask you this nicely. Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I'm insane for thinking this? Because certainly I have no idea what to think about when this has just been said. There's no two-way street to say both hero and villain, because that doesn't make sense. This film might have its merits with its own original creative story that takes on Sleeping Beauty compared to its own original work, but you're making a solution to a problem that has yet to be created until recent times. It's a film that makes you very conflicted to things you already know and doesn't serve to help even if its basis premise was on the fact to learn more about how a character was, or more importantly, a villain became the way that they were, transforming it to a newer degree where it overrides the base story of what it was actually doing. This is the fact of what I mean by at least taking more positives and negatives out of it. You can see an effort put into the characters surrounding Aurora, even going as far to fleshing her out too in this separate film, but also on the other hand, it negates the entire purpose that supposedly connects it to it. The exacerbated problem that resulted in making more similar remakes like Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Lion King, The Little Mermaid, or even just going off less villainous tangents of films like Cruella. That this formula created the less bad characters that were just misunderstood in some way, working their way up to become successful protagonists and then adding more information for events that didn't even need to take place. All of what you know in Disney live action films released in the past couple of years can be traced mostly back to this particular film. The 90s 101 Dalmatians did have its own, but it kept it tight within a different time period that was still possible. Alice at least took place in another period of her life beyond the 1951 version being more older, and then Jungle Book and Cinderella at least stayed within the confines of what was in their own version, nothing adding too much or too less that made them stand out as the best of their genre, staying with what could be realistically possible, at least in some form. So in regards to Maleficent, Disney just took the lessons from this film and just made it a big problem of the entire genre, all due to the fact that it was initially different in its feeling, but also not too much that gave people a reason to see it based upon its initial familiarity. And that's the big problem I have with this film. Not that I hate it or like it these days, like I keep saying. We clearly went through that both in its strengths, good or bad, that can be derived from it, but the entire misuse of how they think we want these characters to be perceived as, becoming more of something they are not. Which brings us to shortly talking about its less successful sequel, Mistress of Evil. And this is a film that continues events onward with a more original story, as most of these don't have any connection to other works. Because the gist of these films is based on the fact that because the live action films get so much attention, that people would simply want more, which is simply not true since most people come for what they already know and can judge on something that can either go right to a great success or massively wrong, as it has been for most Disney works like the direct-to-DVDs. The first film made over $700 million and was a financial success, but this one only made $491 million and needed over $500 million to even thinking about turning a profit, only probably about managing to break even on its budget, showing that it wasn't that great, but how it didn't matter when they released other films like Aladdin, Lion King, Frozen, Avengers, and Star Wars in the same year that made over $1 billion for Disney. And this and Dumbo were the only big setbacks that they had, because in this film, its story can be quite a bit confusing or too much, and frankly not that interesting despite having a good cast. Still continuing the trend of having familiar characters named different, like Philip's own father, King Hubert, now unceremoniously called King John, with his wife, Queen Ingrid, serving as the true main threat as the new villain. Also adding in the fact that you might notice that they casted someone else to play Prince Philip because of scheduling conflicts that made it a bit awkward where the directions just trend down. Reminder, I'm not spending too much time talking about this at all, but just for what the film specifically adds, which frankly is nothing. Because going back to the title is a reference to the real definition of what Maleficent should be as a villain, the mistress of evil itself, but how again it confirms that she is not. She is working in a reputation to not be called that by other people of other kingdoms. She is good, but other people like Ingrid seek to keep her perceived that way with her own ambitions as the main villain. And then you go to the subsection of the film of what species specifically she was when other, fairies or what they call dark fae come in rescuing her as the last of their kind after a human conflict, thinking she would help end things as the descendant of the phoenix, that kind of phoenix. Which kind of gets weird because, Maleficent now is descended from these bird species and, she was a fairy and this way, it doesn't make sense. Which is where they really start losing the plot with additional backstories like that, completely going off the rail from what she was in Sleeping Beauty to whatever this is, expanding into the world of something more of like it was if it was its own franchise. And frankly, in regards to everything that mostly we are talking about, it just doesn't work. Too many ideas, so little time when things finally get solved, putting it more yet telling less to the end goal that is literally the union between characters had at the events of the first. It's visually confusing also, taking place within the bright sky compared to the darkness that fit well with the nature of what Maleficent was, tonally confusing with such ideas. And then by the end, we kind of finally see this where when she does become the Phoenix too after, she gets revived after saving Aurora, and then whatever that scene is, and I really don't like this movie at all. I really have no idea what to say after looking at it and what this actually does or say confirming to Maleficent that we all know and love. I just really can't, because at the end of looking at this movie, it hardly relates to any event we discussed prior to, even in the first live action film, other than the fact it makes her look more sympathetic on her part at the same time other Disney live action films were coming out with their own species and the rest of the fairies, and how it starts to break the entire idea of what Maleficent is too with this character, since she was a part of this thing and this entire kingdom that is a separate tangent from the core philosophy of Sleeping Beauty. She just simply is more of a hero overall in this film, and the only villain of the film just claims to be that she still is. Moreover, a complete anti-villain film, and not just an anti-villain from that definition. Where to sum it all up, Maleficent may have its merits creating something new out of a familiar tale, and it certainly does good to differentiate that, but it simply highlighted a major problem with doing so, removing villains from their original purpose and their standing against a plethora of heroes. Heroes that were made the way that they were so that villains can shape it the other direction, in the ultimate conflict humans have in ourselves to face between what is good and what is evil, and then muddling the definition in the thin line of what we once were, where we just need to stop with this continued trend, because frankly, they just feel justified in continuing all this with films like Mufasa coming out, and the fact that the third Maleficent film is in development too, as of what Angelina Jolie said back in 2023. More of the same and nothing new of substance that makes logical sense to a character. That we instead should remind ourselves the value of who these characters are in their own design and what they can be in terms of their own vices or traits. If they want evil, then so be it. If they aren't, then they shouldn't be. It's more of a mixed scenario where you can make whatever you want it to be, whether you like it or hate it, if you think it is great or terrible, which is completely fine, and I have less problems with that, compared to what would soon come after. And that's all I really have to say. This was actually longer than I expected. So thank you for watching this. I'm all done. Goodbye.